The roses were dying again, and the old man at the upstairs window watched a stranger kneel down to save them. He did not know her name. He knew the day of the week she came, Saturday, early, before the heat settled into the brick of the houses on Marlow Street. He knew the green canvas bag she carried, the one with the broken zipper she had stopped trying to close. He knew the way she set her knees on the folded towel she brought from home, so the dirt would not stain her good work pants. Because she went somewhere after. A job maybe, a church maybe, somewhere that asked her to look presentable. He knew that she worked the bed along the south fence for almost an hour, then the climbing roses by the trellis, then the small herb patch near the back step that his wife had planted the spring before. She got sick. He knew all of this the way a man knows the small machinery of his own loneliness. What he did not know was why she did it. She had never knocked. She had never asked for a thing. For 2 years she had come to a garden that was not hers, in a yard that belonged to a house where a grieving stranger sat behind glass, and she had tended it like it mattered. And then she had gathered her bag and gone. His name was Walter Boyd. He was 71 years old, and he had not gone into the backyard since the morning they took his wife away, in an ambulance that did not bring her back. The garden had been hers, every inch of it. Eleanor Boyd had spent 40 years putting her hands in that soil, and when she died, the soil did not know to stop needing her. The weeds came. The roses leaned and browned. Walter watched it go to ruin from the kitchen window and could not make himself walk out there, because walking out there meant standing in a place built entirely by a woman who was gone, and he did not have it in him, so he let it die. He told himself he did not care. And then one Saturday, in the second spring of his widowhood, a woman he had never seen pushed open the side gate, looked at the wreck of the beds for a long moment, knelt down, and began to pull the chickweed from around the roots of a dying rose as if she had been hired to do it. Nobody had hired her. That was the thing he could not understand. If you have ever watched someone do a kindness they did not have to do, and felt something in your chest you could not name, stay with this one. It matters how it ends. The woman's name was Renee Carter, and she was 34, and she had not slept more than 5 hours a night in longer than she could remember. She cleaned houses. That was the work, and she was not ashamed of it, though she had learned early which people would look at her hands and decide things about her, and which people would not. She had 4 families on her regular route, big houses up on the north end of town where the lawns were cut by services and the kitchens were the size of her whole apartment. And on Saturdays she did a half-day for a couple named the Hendersons, 2 streets over from Marlow. That was how she had first walked past the house on Marlow Street. She had taken the shortcut down Marlow because the bus let her off at the wrong end, and she had seen the garden. She had seen the garden the way you see a person sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, and you do not know their story, but you know it is not a good one. The roses were the first thing. They were old roses, the kind people did not plant anymore, climbing up a wooden trellis that had gone grey and soft at the joints, and they were starving. Anybody could see it. The canes were leggy and crossed and choked with bindweed, and half the blooms had black spot eating the leaves, and there were 3 dead canes that should have been cut out a year ago. Renee had grown up with a grandmother who kept roses, and her hands knew the work before her mind had decided anything. She stood at the fence and looked at those dying flowers and thought about her grandmother, who had been gone 11 years, and something in her would not let her keep walking. She told herself she would just pull the bindweed. Just the bindweed. Just this once, because it would take 10 minutes and the roses would breathe. So she let herself in through the side gate, which was not locked, the latch lifting under her thumb with a small worn click that told her many hands had lifted it over many years, and she knelt down on the bare dirt and she worked. The bindweed came up in long white roots that snapped if you pulled too fast, so she did not pull fast. He loosened each one and drew it whole from the soil and laid it in a pile on the path, and the smell of turned earth came up around her, green and cold and familiar, and somewhere in the middle of it she stopped thinking about the bus and the Hendersons and the rent. 10 minutes became 40. She found the 3 dead canes, grey and brittle, and she cut them out low with the folding knife she kept in her bag, and the rows seemed to stand up straighter once they were gone, the way a person does when you lift something off them. She cleared the worst of the weeds from around the base. And when she stood up and looked at what she had done, the bed looked cared for, the dark soil clean around the green, and she felt a quiet she had not felt in months. The particular quiet of a thing set right, and she thought, I will come back next week and do the trellis. She did not know anyone was watching. She thought the house was empty. The curtains upstairs never moved, and there was no car in the drive, and the whole place had the hell-breath stillness of somewhere nobody lived. She figured it for an estate caught up in probate, a dead owner and heirs who lived far away and did not care, and she figured no one would mind if she kept a dying garden alive until somebody came to sell the house. That was the story she told herself, and it was a kind story, and it was wrong in every part. Except the dying Walter watched her come back the next Saturday and the one after that. By the fourth week he had moved a chair to the upstairs window so he could sit while he watched. He could not have told you why he watched. At first it was suspicion, the reflexive wariness of an old man living alone, waiting to see what she would take. She took nothing. She brought things. She brought a bag of bone meal one week and worked it into the soil around the roses. She brought a proper pair of pruners the week after that, and she cut the climbers back. The right way, the way Eleanor used to, opening the centre, and Walter had pressed his hand flat against the glass without knowing he had done it. She brought marigolds in little plastic cups in May and tucked them in along the border where Eleanor had always put marigolds, and Walter had to leave the window that day because his throat had closed and his eyes were burning, and he was a man who did not cry, who had not cried at the funeral, who had held himself together with both fists for 2 years. And a stranger planting marigolds had nearly undone him. He should have gone down. He knew that. Any decent man would have gone down those stairs and out the back door and said, "Thank you," said, "Who are you?" said, "You do not have to do this, but it is the kindest thing anyone has done for me since my wife died." He rehearsed it some nights. The stairs, though, felt like a country he had lost the visa to, and the back door opened onto Eleanor's garden, and to walk into it would be to admit she was not coming back to it, and so he stayed at the window. A coward, he called himself. He watched a good woman tend his dead wife's roses for free, week after week, and he hid behind a curtain like a child, and he hated himself for it, and still he did not go down. The seasons turned. Rennie learned the garden the way you learn a face. She knew the herb patch came up volunteer every spring, the oregano and the thyme spreading where someone had planted them with love, and she kept them weeded and let them run. She knew the south bed got too much afternoon sun, and she moved the hostas that were scorching to the shade by the fence. She found a small concrete bird bath tipped over in the long grass behind the shed, and she set it upright and scrubbed the green from it and kept it filled, and within a month there were sparrows. She did not know that the man at the window had given that bird bath to his wife for their 30th anniversary. She only knew it was a sad and pretty thing lying on its side, and she could not leave it that way. Her own life did not get easier while she tended someone else's flowers. Her car, a 15-year-old sedan with a check engine light she had learned to ignore, finally died in February, and for 6 weeks she took 2 buses and a long walk to reach her North End houses, and she still came to Marlow Street on Saturdays, walking the last mile in the cold. Her landlord raised the rent on the apartment she shared with her son, and she picked up a 5th family to cover it, which meant she lost the only morning she had kept for herself. Her son, Marcus, was 9, and he was bright in a way that scared her because she did not know how she would pay for the future his brightness deserved. He asked her once why she spent her Saturday morning at a house where nobody lived. She told him because the flowers needed somebody, and that was all the answer she had. And he had looked at her with his father's eyes, which she never spoke about, and said, "Okay, Mama," and that had been that. Walter learned her son existed the day Marcus came with her. It was a Saturday in the fall, a school holiday, and Renee had no one to leave the boy with, so she brought him. And Walter watched from the window as the woman who tended his garden taught her child how to deadhead a rose. She showed him where to cut, just above the leaf with 5 leaflets, and the boy did it wrong and she did not scold him. She put her hand over his and guided the blades and let him do the next one himself, and when he got it right she touched the back of his head. Just for a second, the way you touch something you would die for. Walter had no children. He and Eleanor had wanted them, and they had not come, and that absence had been the one grief of their long marriage. And now an old man sat alone at a window and watched a mother and her son in his backyard and grieved a whole life he had never gotten to have. He did not resent them for it. That surprised him. He only ached, and the ache had a sweetness in it he did not have a word for. The truth he had been circling for 2 years was simple, and it was this. Walter was not a poor man. The empty look of the house was a lie. He had let stand because he could not bear to fix anything. He had been an engineer for a company that built water systems, and he had done well, better than well, and there was a brokerage account with a number in it that would have made Renee sit down on the dirt if she had known. He had no one to leave it to. Eleanor was gone, there were no children, his brother had died young, and the lawyer who handled his affairs had asked him gently, more than once, whether he had given thought to what he wanted done with what he had. He had not. He had not given thought to anything since the ambulance. The money sat in its account the way the garden had sat in its ruin, untended, meaningless, the residue of a life that had stopped having a point. And every Saturday a woman who did not have 2 good buses to her name knelt in his dead wife's flowers and asked him for nothing. He started to leave things for her. Small things at first, because he was ashamed to do more, ashamed that small was all his courage could manage. He left a new pair of garden gloves on the back step one Friday night, the good leather kind, in a paper bag with no note, and he stood at the upstairs window the next morning and watched her find them. She lifted them out of the bag and turned them over in her hands and looked up at the house for a long moment straight at the window, and Walter stepped back into the shadow of the room with his heart going like a boy's. She wore the gloves the next week. He saw the new leather on her hands as she worked, and something in him eased that he had not known was clenched. He left a watering can the week after, a heavy galvanized one, the size of which told her somebody meant for the garden to be watered properly. He left a bag of good compost. Each Friday night he carried something down the stairs and set it on the step and went back up, and it became a kind of conversation, the only kind he could manage, an old man speaking in objects to a woman who answered by using them. He left, once, an envelope with $200 in it, and the words "for the flowers" written on the front in his careful engineer's hand, and she did not take it. She left it on the step the next Saturday. She weighted it down with a smooth grey stone from the garden so it would not blow away, and beside it she left a note of her own, the first words that had ever passed between them, written on a torn half-sheet of notebook paper in pencil, and the note said, "You do not owe me anything. 2. I am glad somebody is home. Be well." And Walter sat down on the floor of his upstairs bedroom with that note in his hands and wept until his chest hurt, because somebody was home. She had said, "Somebody is home," as if she had known all along that he was up there, as if she had been tending his grief along with the roses the whole time, and had simply never said so to spare him the shame of being seen. Have you ever been seen like that? By someone who asked nothing back? Hold on to that feeling. You are going to need it for the end. She had known. That was what Walter did not understand, and what Renee had never said. She had known he was there since the 3rd or 4th week, because once early she had glanced up at exactly the wrong moment and seen the pale shape of a face behind the upstairs glass before it pulled away. She had not been frightened. She had grown up around old people, around the particular stillness of someone who has outlived the reason they used to move through their days, and she recognized it. She understood without being told that the garden belonged to a sorrow, and that the man behind the window could not come out, and she made a decision that she never spoke aloud, which was that she would not force him to. She would not knock, she would not wave. She would simply keep the flowers alive and let him watch, because watching something live again was maybe all he could do right now, and maybe it was enough, and maybe one day it would be the thing that brought him down the stairs. She tended the man as carefully as she tended the roses, by leaving him alone, by giving him something to look at that was not death. She had buried her own grandmother. She knew what it was to need a reason to look out a window. The winter of the 2nd year was hard. Marcus got sick on a Tuesday, a small cough at breakfast that by nightfall had become a fever of 103 that would not come down no matter what she did. She put cool cloths on his forehead. She gave him the medicine the bottle allowed and counted the hours until she could give him more. At 3 in the morning, his eyes were glassy and he did not quite know her, and she stopped counting hours and called a cab she could not afford and carried him down the stairwell, wrapped in his blanket, 9 years old, and too heavy to carry, and she carried him anyway. The county hospital took him back behind the double doors, and she sat in the waiting room with her coat still on, and then they admitted him, and she spent 2 nights in a hard plastic chair beside his bed, holding his hand and praying the way her grandmother had taught her. Plain words, no performance, just please and thank you and please again. The nurses were kind. One of them brought her a blanket of her own around midnight and did not say anything, just laid it over her shoulders, and Renee had nearly broken at the small mercy of it. The fever broke on the 3rd morning. Marcus woke up himself again, hungry, asking for pancakes, and Renee laughed and put her face down on the edge of the bed and let herself shake for a minute where he could not see. The bill, when it came, was $4,200. She did not have $4,200. She had nothing close. She sat at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the paper in front of her and the calculator she used for her route. And she did the arithmetic she already knew the answer to, the rent and the new car payment and the groceries and the bus passes against what 5 families paid her, and the numbers did not bend no matter how she pushed them. And she felt the floor of her life give way the slow way it always did, not a fall, just a tilt. Just the sense that she was sliding towards something and there was nothing to grab. She missed a Saturday for the first time in 2 years. She could not have said why it mattered with everything else pressing on her, but it sat on her like a small additional grief through that whole grey week, that the roses would go unwatered, that the herb patch would dry, that the man at the window would look out on Saturday morning and the gate would not open and he would not know why, and there was no way to tell him. Walter looked out and she was not there. He did not know about the boy, or the fever, or the bill. He only knew that for the first Saturday in 2 years the gate did not open, and the absence of her was so loud that he stood at the window for an hour as if his standing there could call her back. When the second Saturday came and the gate stayed shut, something happened in Walter that 2 years of grief had not managed to do. He got afraid. Not the small fear of an old man, but the large fear of a man who has just understood that the one thread connecting him to the living world has gone slack, and that he does not even know the name of the person on the other end of it. He had let her tend his garden for 2 years, and he had never once found out who she was or where she lived or how to reach her if she stopped coming, and now she had stopped coming, and he had nothing, no name, no number, no way to know if she was alive. He had wasted 2 years behind glass. The shame of it got him to the top of the stairs. The fear of never knowing got him to the bottom. He went out the back door for the first time since the ambulance. The garden held him the way he had been afraid it would, every plant a sentence in Eleanor's handwriting, and he stood in it and shook and did not fall down. The marigolds were there, the roses were pruned and breathing. The bird bath he had given his wife stood upright and full, and a sparrow sat on its rim and did not fly away from the old man crying in the middle of the flowers. He made himself look at all of it. He made himself understand that it was alive because a stranger had kept it alive, and that he had been given 2 years of his wife's garden as a gift by someone who would not even take $200 for it, and that he did not know her name. He went to the side gate, and he looked up and down Marlow Street as if she might be walking up it, and she was not. And for the first time in his life, Walter had no plan and no calculation and no way forward except the oldest one there is, which is to go and find the person and ask. He started with the Hendersons, 2 streets over, because once, long ago, he thought he had seen the woman come from that direction. He had not left his block in months, and the walk took everything he had, but he made it to their door, and he knocked, and a tired, pleasant woman answered, and Walter, who had not spoken a full sentence to a stranger in 2 years, said, "I am looking for a woman who cleans houses. She tends my garden. I do not know her name." And the Hendersons knew exactly who he meant, because Renee cleaned for them on Saturdays, and the woman's face changed when he described the garden on Marlow, and she said, "Oh, that is Renee Carter." And then her face changed again, and she said she had a hard week. Her little boy was in the hospital. And she gave Walter an address, and she gave him a phone number. and she watched the old man write them down with a hand that would not stay steady, and she did not understand what she was looking at, only that it was something. Walter did not call. A phone felt like another pane of glass, and he had spent 2 years behind glass. He paid a neighbor's grandson $20 to drive him across town to the address the Henderson woman had given him, and the boy drove with the radio low and did not ask questions, and Walter watched the city he had stopped looking at go by the window, the closed storefronts and the bus stops and the people living their Saturday lives, and he understood how long he had been gone from it. The address was a block of apartments with a cracked lot and a stairwell that smelled of other people's dinners, frying onions and something with cumin in it, and he climbed to the second floor with his hand on the rail and stopped in front of a door numbered 2B, and found that his courage, which had carried him this far, had run all the way out. He stood there a long time. He listened to a television going somewhere down the hall and a child laughing in another apartment, and he thought about Eleanor, who had always been braver than him, who would have knocked an hour ago, who used to take his hand at parties and walk him into rooms he was afraid of. He put his hand flat against the door once the way he used to put it against the upstairs glass. Then he knocked. Renee opened the door with the chain on, and she saw an old man she had never seen up close, a thin old man in a good coat, gone loose on his shoulders. And for a second she did not know him. Then she did. She knew the eyes. She had seen them behind glass for 2 years, pale and far away. And now they were in front of her, close, red-rimmed and frightened and shining, and her own hand came up to her mouth. She slid the chain and opened the door, and neither of them said anything for a moment that went on too long, the two of them looking at each other across a threshold that 2 years of Saturdays had been quietly building toward. Behind her, in the small, bright apartment, a boy of 9 looked up from a couch where he was wrapped in a blanket, his fever broken, alive, a colouring book open on his knees, and Walter looked past the woman at the child and understood that this was who she had been racing home to all those Saturdays. This was the weight she had carried. While she knelt in his flowers, this whole life had been going on behind her quiet hands the entire time, and he had known nothing of it. "I am Walter," he said. "I am the man at the window." And Renee, who had carried his grief without ever being thanked, who had not asked one thing of him in 2 years, did the only thing her heart knew how to do. She stepped back and she said, "Would you like to come in? You look tired. Let me make you something." And the old man, who had not sat at another person's table since his wife died, came into the small apartment of a house cleaner and her son, and he sat down, and she put a cup of tea in front of him, and for the first time in 2 years, Walter was not alone with his grief. He learned everything that afternoon. He sat at her small kitchen table with the tea going cold and warm again as she refilled it, and she talked, slowly at first, and then more easily, the way people do when someone has finally asked. He learned about the grandmother and the roses, the woman who had kept a rose garden behind a rented house and taught a small girl where to cut and how to listen to a plant that was struggling. He learned about the car that died in February and the 6 weeks of 2 buses and the long cold walk, and how she had still come to Marlow Street every Saturday in that stretch because stopping had not occurred to her. He learned that her son was named Marcus and that he was 9, and that he read above his grade and asked questions she could not always answer, and that the future his brightness deserved kept her awake at night more than the rent did. He learned, without her telling him, about the $4,200 bill, because he saw it lying on the kitchen counter when she got up to put the kettle on again, the hospital letterhead and the figure in bold at the bottom, and he memorized it the way he memorized everything, by accident and forever, and he did not say a word. He learned the thing that undid him last. She told him plainly, not as a kindness she wanted credit for, but just as a fact she felt he had earned the right to know, that she had seen his face at the window in the 3rd or 4th week 2 years ago, and that she had known ever since that he was up there. She had known the whole time. She had kept his secret and tended his sorrow on purpose, week after week, and never said so, because she understood he could not come out, and she did not want to make him. When she said it, in that even quiet voice, looking at him across the small table, he had to put his cup down, because his hands were shaking too hard to hold it. He understood then that she had been doing to his garden exactly what she did to her own life. She kept it alive. She did not ask why it was hard, she just knelt down and did the work. And she had done the same for him, a stranger behind glass, for 2 years, for nothing, and he had spent those 2 years thinking he was the one watching her, when all along she had been watching him too, and waiting, patient as a gardener, for something to bloom. Walter went home that evening, changed, and a changed man with resources is a dangerous and wonderful thing. He called his lawyer Monday morning, the lawyer who had asked him so many times what he wanted done with what he had, and he said, "I know now." The first thing he did was small and quiet, and he did it without telling her, because he had learned from her that the best kindnesses come with no note and no claim. He paid the hospital bill, the whole of it, $4,200, gone. And when Renee called the billing office a week later to set up a payment plan she could not afford, the woman on the phone told her the balance was zero, paid in full, and Renee sat down on her kitchen floor with the phone in her hand because she had not told anyone the number, not anyone, except that an old man had seen it on her counter and said nothing. She knew it was him. She went to Marlow Street that Saturday, and the gate was unlocked as always, and the old man was not at the window, he was in the garden. He was sitting on a bench by the trellis that had not been there the week before, a new bench, plain cedar, still pale and smelling faintly of the lumber yard, and he had a thermos and 2 tin cups set beside him, and he had been waiting for her, she could see, for a while. She came through the gate and stopped on the path. The roses were opening behind him. He stood up slow, one hand on the arm of the bench, and he looked at her across the garden she had kept alive for 2 years, and he said, "You should not have to do this for free anymore." And she said, "I never did it for money." And he said, "I know. That is why." He poured the coffee with a hand that was steadier than it had been at her door, and she sat down beside him, because her legs had gone uncertain, and the two of them, the widower and the house cleaner, sat on the bench in Eleanor's garden and drank coffee while the sparrows came down to the bird bath and the morning warmed around them. Walter told her then what he had decided, all of it, laid out plainly the way an engineer lays out a plan, and Renee cried in a way she had not let herself cry in years, not the careful crying of a woman who has to hold it together for her son, who cannot afford to come apart on a Tuesday, but the deep, helpless crying of someone who has been carrying a great weight for a very long time and has just felt a pair of hands take one end of it and lift. He did not give her money, not the way you might think, not a check pressed into her hand to be spent and gone. Walter had been an engineer. He built things that lasted. What he built for Renee was meant to last. He set up an account for Marcus for college, fully funded, every year that boy would ever need, so that the brightness that scared his mother would have somewhere to go. He bought Renee a reliable car, a sensible thing, nothing flashy, because he had listened when she talked, and he knew flashy was not what she wanted. She wanted to not be afraid on a cold morning that the engine would not turn. And he asked her, not as charity, but as a job with real wages and real respect, to come and run the garden properly, to be the keeper of the thing his wife had loved, because he was old and he could not do it, and she was the only person alive he trusted with it. He paid her more for 2 days a week than 3 of her cleaning houses had paid her for 6. She tried to refuse. He would not let her. "You have been paying me for 2 years," he said, "in a coin I did not know I needed, and I am only now able to pay you back, and you will let an old man balance his books." The garden came all the way back that year, and so did Walter. He went out into it every day now. He learned the names of the roses again, the ones Eleanor had taught him, and he had let himself forget, and he taught them to Marcus, who came on Saturdays and grew tall among the flowers, and called the old man Mr. Walter, and then, by the end of the summer, just Walter, and Walter did not correct him. The 3 of them made a strange family in the way that real families are often strange, assembled out of need and grief and the slow accident of showing up, week after week, for someone who could not yet show up for themselves. Eleanor's garden, which had nearly died of a man's inability to walk into it, became the most cared-for garden on Marlow Street, and people walking past would slow to look at it the way Renee had once slowed 2 years and a lifetime ago, and some of them would wonder what kind of love it took to keep a place like that. Walter lived 4 more years, which is more than the doctors had quietly expected of a man who had stopped wanting to live. He spent them in the garden, When he died in the spring in his sleep, the way the lucky ones go, his lawyer read the will to a small group in a small room, and there was not much surprise in it for anyone who had watched the last years of his life. He left the house on Marlow Street to Renee, and the garden with it, and a sum of money that the lawyer read out in a flat professional voice, and that made Renee put her hand over her mouth the way she had the day he first appeared at her door. Marcus sat beside her in a borrowed suit, 16 now and quiet, and he reached over and took his mother's other hand. There was a letter with the will, in the careful engineer's hand, the same hand that had once written for the flowers on an envelope she would not cash, and it was short, and it said, "You kept the flowers alive until I could come outside. You knew I was there, and you let me be a coward as long as I needed to be one, and then you let me stop. You never asked me for anything, so I am not asking you either. I am only telling you that the garden is yours, and the house is yours, and Marcus is going to college, and none of it is charity, all of it is owed. A debt is a debt, even when it is paid in flowers. Be well, somebody is home." Renee read the last line twice. It was her own line, the words she had left him on the back step years before, waited under a stone so the wind would not take them. He had given them back to her. She stood in the garden that was hers now, in the late spring, with the roses just beginning to open along the trellis and her son beside her, taller than her shoulder now, and she looked up at the upstairs window, where for 2 years a grieving man had watched a stranger save the thing his wife had loved. The window was empty, the sun was on the glass. She did not cry. Not then. She knelt down by the south bed, the way she had the very first morning, and she put her hands in Eleanor's soil, which had become Walter's soil, which was hers now, and she began to pull the chickweed from around the roots of a rose, because that was who she was, and because the flowers still needed somebody, and because some kinds of love do not end. They just change hands. If this story moved you, take a moment and tell me about the kindest thing a stranger ever did for you, the small one, the one they did not have to do. And if you want another story about the quiet ways the world keeps a ledger, about the good that comes back around when you have stopped expecting it, I have one waiting for you, and it begins with a single mother and a coat she gave away in the rain.